Hello and welcome. Thank you all for attending our Black History Month program. Tonight we'll be screening a special film documentary titled John Burris, the Godfather of Police Litigation. My name is Robert Milton. I'm the co-chair of the Arts Forum here at the Commonwealth Club World Affairs. I'll be your host this evening for this program. The club is very thrilled and honored to screen this special and timely film documentary. The documentary highlights Burris' life, police brutality, and some of his notable high-profile cases. We're very honored to have the filmmakers, Doug Harris, Brian Spencer, and John Burris with us this evening for an intimate conversation later in the program. After the program, we'll have a reception at the Hormel Lounge right out these two doors here. Our moderator tonight is the one and only Carolyn Tyler. She is an award-winning journalist, retired as anchor and reporter at KGO TV and ABC7 after 32 years. Tyler currently serves on the San Francisco Film Commission, and for all the lawyers in the room, she has 4 brothers who are attorneys. Please welcome Carolyn Tyler to the stage.
Ooh, it's bright up here. So I'm going to bring up the filmmakers, Brian Spencer and Doug Harris, who put together this marvelous documentary. You're going to see just a bit of it because it really is an hour and a half, and they have condensed it to 40 minutes, the best of the hour and a half. And so without further ado, I would like for Doug Harris and Brian Spencer to come join me.
Thank you, Carolyn.
How are you this evening?
Oh, doing well.
Okay, and Brian?
I'm well, thank you.
This is a great audience to have. I happened to see your documentary in Berkeley a couple of weeks ago. Great audience there as well. Let's start by talking about this documentary called John Burris, Godfather of Police Litigation. What I understand is that you normally do documentaries on people who have gone before us, who are dearly departed. These are people who deserve to have their stories known, to have a spotlight shined on their life and their legacy. What made you decide to do something on the living legend who is John Burris?
Well, my last film that I produced last year, which was called All American, the Walter Gordon story, prominent civil rights attorney here in the Bay Area in Berkeley. And for that documentary, I needed the preeminent civil rights attorney of today to help, tell the story of what it's like to be a civil rights attorney, and what better person could I pick for that role in the All-American documentary than John Burris? And so what happened was I cut a deal with John. And I told John, I said, look, once you help me with Walter Gordon's documentary, what we'll do is we'll look at and start developing a story about yourself. And that's kind of like how this film came to fruition, through a deal I cut with John.
And so how long ago was that?
That was like a year and a half, about a year and a half ago. That Brian and I have been working on this film. And it's really been a pleasure for me to work with someone who's here, who I could get on the phone and call, regularly, as opposed to, like you mentioned earlier, that a lot of the documentaries that I've produced over the last 25 years have been about people that have passed on. And so it's really been pleasurable to, do a documentary story with somebody who I could just pick up the phone and call at any time. And it's really been a pleasure working with John on this film. And I love this story.
Brian, do you want to add?
I do. I would echo what Doug had to say about how pleasurable the experience was. John made it very easy for us to produce a great film. He has a treasure trove in terms of archival footage and other materials. Doug and I were very thankful because it really made the research on the film much, much easier. So a wonderful experience working with Mr. Burris.
I saw a lot of archival material from KPIX. I don't know where was KGO. I don't know. You did not seem to have any Channel 7 archives, John. I don't know why, but so your technique, Doug and Brian, is unique because the documentary does not rely on narration. It relies on interviews and sound bites. So how did you decide that that would be an effective method of storytelling?
Well, that's pretty much a style that I developed early on when I first started doing documentary film projects. You know, I tried to do some voiceover narration, you know, like 25 years ago, and it just turned out like crap. and so I developed this style where I work to let the subjects tell the story, and it's a real difficult process when you try to make the dialogue transition and connect. But it's kind of developed into a style of mine, and I really enjoy documentaries where all of the interview subjects, they play a role, an integral role in telling the story. And it's quite difficult, but that's one of the things I enjoy about that style is because you're talking to people who actually were a part of the subject's life or whatever it was that they were involved with. So you're hearing the story firsthand. Somebody that was there, that was a part of it, a family member, co-worker, a teammate, or whatever. And to me, that's just, it makes it more authentic, you know, as opposed to someone reading a script and kind of like holding your hand and guiding you through the story. I really like my style.
Well, your style works. So you have dozens of people. I'm not sure how you chose who you did to further the John Burris story, but Brian, was there anyone that you wanted to interview that said no?
To the contrary, we had a number of folks who unfortunately we were not able to include. The response was almost overwhelming. Every time we made a call or sent an email, folks were very excited to be part of this process. So I cannot think of anyone who said, no, I would not like to participate. I think that's a testament to the power of the body of work that Mr. Burris has produced. He's always been very, very empathetic towards the community, and I think people recognize his empathy, his genuine concern for people. And along the way, Doug and I found out something very, very interesting about John. He has mentored countless numbers of people. I think you were at the Berkeley show.
Yes.
And the moderator asked everyone who had been influenced, represented by, mentored by John to stand up. And I counted about 6 dozen people in that category. So that is a testament to his dedication to the community.
That leads into the question I was going to ask about John. Most of his cases are well documented. So what is something that you learned about him? And you're talking about the mentorship. What else did you learn?
Oh, was that for me or Brian?
Either.
Brian, you take that.
The volume of work is incredible. And as we were going through the process, John would just mentioned things in a very offhanded way that were incredibly significant. So it speaks to the depth and breadth of his work, both domestically and internationally. So one example, we were sitting talking one day, and he said, "Oh, by the way, guys, do you remember when the embassies in Africa were bombed?" We said, "Yeah, of course." He said, "I was on that case too." And so when you start to talk about his impact across the world, it's amazing. And then the number of civil rights attorneys who he has helped develop, all of the leading civil rights attorneys now have engaged with Mr. Burris as young attorneys. So he talks about passing the baton, and he's done an outstanding job of creating a legacy and a legion of people who will continue the work after he has decided to put it down.
I could speak about one of the big challenges in putting John's film together. And John just kept shooting more and more people at us to interview. And John don't really understand the concept of producing documentary films. You know, what you do is you have, you know, a lineup of people, but the lineup kept growing because John would call me and Brian. Now, me and Brian, we had this thing called the night shift. And we work on the films at nighttime for the most part. But John would keep adding more people. And then as I would call these people up and do a pre-interview conversation with them, I was like, the cast just started getting stronger and stronger. I mean, I would talk to these people, and they would just have these incredible stories that really fit my idea of a really good story. And I couldn't, you know, turn them down. You know, it wasn't like John referred me to a dud. I mean, these people were all had great stories to tell. And, you know, Brian and I, we were just trying to figure out how we're going to include all these people into a cohesive story that made sense. And so, John, I'm a little mad at you about that, but as long as everybody's happy at the way things turned out, I'll give you a pass.
And so what we're going to see tonight is a 40-minute clip from an hour-and-a-half documentary, which I know was hard to boil down. What do you hope the audience will take away?
Brian, you can go for that one. I don't want to take up all the time.
That's a complex question. I mean, because they'll take away so many things. The empathy, the dedication to the community, the dogged determination in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds. When you're a civil rights attorney, you have to be all in. The whole system is designed to defeat you. So I think what's going to shine is the determination. John has moved mountains in the legal world. And so I think that's something that your audience will take away this evening, is how difficult the work is, and in spite of the difficulties, the perseverance that he displays.
And your thoughts?
Well, I want people to see the 90-minute version of this film. You know, but, you know, time constraints, we only had so much time for this program tonight. But what I'm working diligently on is getting everything secure, you know, for our PBS broadcast. Similar to my other PBS documentaries, they do really good on PBS, and they're viewed all over the country. So what I'm doing right now is working on the legal aspects of the documentary process, where, you know, you have to get all your licenses and your rights and clearances together so that we can enter into our errors and omissions insurance, so that we can share this with the whole country through our PBS station partner. So I'm really looking forward to that. Now, there'll be an airing version, a television version of the documentary that'll be 56 minutes and 40 seconds. So that'll be, you know, what you look at on TV. But I was informed that PBS's online platform, which is called PBS Viewfinder, they're going to allow us to show the full 90 minutes on Viewfinder, so I'm really happy about that. So, you know, folks want to watch it on KQED or KVIE or any of the PBS stations, the television version, that's cool, but when you want to get the real story, check out Viewfinder, because you'll get the whole 90 minutes online.
That's great. It deserves to have that full 90-minute showing. And I wanted to know, what can we as an audience do to help you get the widespread distribution that it deserves?
Well, what I'd like to, everyone here, I want to deputize everybody here that if they like this documentary, you know, spread the word about it, because I truly believe John Burris' story is an important story, and especially in today's world when we have a new administration that's pretty much exonerating all police officers for their misconduct around the country. And I don't know if you guys are aware of what's going on right now with the Department of Justice here in our country, that they have recently canceled the Civil Rights Division. And we have a cast member in our documentary who was the first lawyer for the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice back in the early 1960s, during the protests and marches with Martin Luther King down in the South. And so, you know, when you no longer have those protections nationally, you know, we're in for a rough ride. That pretty much gives, you know, police an officer to act a fool, police to act a fool whenever they want to. And so this is a real challenging period in our country. And it's people like John Burris that are going to be right in there fighting tooth and nail to bring justice to people that deserve it.
Yes, I think that deserves applause. And thank you, John, for all those attorneys that are coming after you with your leadership and help. So we want to see this clip. So I think everyone should give our filmmakers, Doug Harris and Brian Spencer, a round of applause. And without further ado, I think we're going to get out of the way so that we can see the clip.
All
Very
right.
good.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Carolyn.
You're welcome.
Let me give you a hand.
I became interested in law after having watched the civil rights movement unfold. And there I could see that there were people who were marching and there were all that activity, but I was most intrigued by the lawyers. Thurgood Marshall was somebody I read about a lot. And so my interest always was the legal component of the civil rights movement. Starting out, I went to law school. I didn't know what kind of lawyer I was going to be. I had thought, frankly, that criminal law was the law that you did as a civil rights lawyer.
John Burris, just the word itself says premier lawyer.
I met John Burris over in Alameda County, and I was active in civil rights the movement in those days, and so was he, along with a lot of other people.
My first impression of John Burris was that he was young and full of energy and committed to the cause, and that he was the person who was, in fact, holding police accountable.
I grew up in San Francisco. I grew up in public housing, and there was, unfortunately, a lot of tension with the police department, and we witnessed police brutality. There was no cell phone video footage and other tools that exist now to really document it. There was only the hope and the prayer that someone like a John Burris would be around to help us combat it.
So I really got to know him when he was trying the Rodney King case. Watching the brutality of the Los Angeles Police Department that beat the hell out of that poor guy. He took on the whole police department, the whole regiment, if you will, the whole hierarchy of police. And I watched John Burris take him on in the LA case.
At the time John Burris did the Rodney King matter, there was no such thing as a legal television analyst.
Stand by the prosecution. John Burris, you would have put him on the stand, would you not?
Yeah, I would have put him on. I thought it was an error in judgment and them not putting him on. I understand that they probably had a switch in strategy as the trial progressed and therefore made the decision not to do it, even though they...
He actually carried us into the courtroom.
Many in the legal profession believe that it was inappropriate and not smart or wise, and it demeaned the profession by engaging in communications and conversations which were outside the typical legal circles. And as such, many looked at it with disdain.
And so I saw it as an opportunity through the media for people to become aware of the kind of cases and the work that I was involved in. And it's also important in terms of the clients that I represent, because many of the clients that I represent, all of them, cannot speak for themselves. These are people who are on the lower end of the economic strata, they're on the social strata, and they have no political real power. And so what I do is speak for them.
My mom walked John through every case that he had, and he ran the cases by her. You know, because she was a psychiatric technician. My mom was an advocate for John in terms of whatever it is that he was involved in.
John Burris sort of crept onto my radar slowly. I knew he had a reputation working in Los Angeles, and he had represented Tupac Shakur as well, so he was known.
The Oakland Riders case is a case where at least 4, but more, officers were engaged in this consistent pattern, trying to force confessions and causing people to go to jail for crimes they didn't commit.
When I joined the Oakland Police Department in the late 1990s, I immediately began to work in patrol. I was working the night shift, but I oftentimes heard stories about the things that was happening in the streets that I didn't know about. And these were individuals that I had actually sat in a room with.
The 4 officers are accused of conspiracy, kidnapping, assault, making false police reports, and planting evidence. They worked the midnight shift in West Oakland and got nicknamed the Riders.
It was started when Jerry Brown was mayor of Oakland, but it didn't go reported, and the police were abusing their authority. Some say directly, some say indirectly, on orders from then Mayor Jerry Brown to clean up West Oakland.
4 officers have been caught. It doesn't mean that there are other officers who are on the department who are not engaged in the conduct, because they clearly are. So the question is, how do you get to those officers?
And John filed a lawsuit against him, a class action in which he represented 119 Oakland citizens.
It is very difficult to bring successful suits against police officers and police departments. There are so many ways in which the law is stacked in favor of the police officer and the police department.
When I took on the Riders case, it was my clear goal at the time to take complete control of this department and to revamp it totally. Change the culture, stop racial profiling, stop discriminatory policing, stop the beatings, stop the shootings. All this was my goal.
And John settled for almost $11 million. This was a settlement. It's important to realize that the city sat down with John and they said, here's what you've charged us with. And they agreed to it. It wasn't like there was a fight and we didn't do it. They said, we're going to correct those things. And they estimated that they would do it in 5 years.
The Oscar Grant situation, that is Oscar being killed by a BART police officer on the platform with a number of his friends present, was a case that came to me within a day or so.
When my nephew Oscar Grant was murdered, we knew that we needed the best civil rights attorney that we can find. And we felt that someone with some skills can help us get justice. And so that's when our relationship with John Burris really began.
And so I could see immediately that this case was bigger than the average case. I went out to the scene that very first day that I got the case. I got all the boys who were present, went out to the scene, reenacted the scene so I could see where everyone was at the time the shooting of Oscar taking place, what role each person played, and immediately I could see this is flat-out murder. And I could also see this is going to be a big deal.
When I first learned about the killing of Oscar Grant at the BART station, I was shocked like everybody else, even though I knew and had represented people who had experienced police brutality.
Johannes Vesey claimed he thought Oscar had a gun, so he pulls out his revolver, shoots Oscar, center mask in the back.
Get on the train! They just shot him! Get on the train! They just shot that guy!
The bullet goes through his body, hit the concrete floor, comes back up, hit him in his lung, so he's shot twice with one bullet.
So this was a situation with cell phones were being clipped as this whole beating and shooting took place. And so there were a lot of witnesses to it, and that made it horrifying for everyone.
And I remember being with the lawyers in my office the first time we got the video and we played it, and everybody just looked, and we were just astonished, like, wow, they just killed him. You know, it was so unnecessary.
John Burris, through his work as a lawyer, has made a tremendous difference with regard to advancing civil rights, getting recovery for victims of abuses. But one of the things that's also important is John Burris has played a key role in mentoring and training so many who are the civil rights lawyers of today.
I first became aware of John Burris when he represented the family of Oscar Grant. And he was a trailblazer because for somebody like me at the time who was still in law school, you saw adequate, zealous representation. Police misconduct is one of the worst challenges for American society today, as it has been for decades. Really, when you have police misconduct and there's no accountability for that police misconduct, it builds a bridge of mistrust between law enforcement and the community.
Being a civil rights lawyer is a challenge in terms of the work itself. So in the 30 years or 40 years I've been doing this work, I've seen this whole progression. When I first started, jurors did not believe that police did anything wrong. But I had to overcome that over a period of time. And so in the cases I've been involved in, some of which I've talked about before, the Rodney King case, even though Rodney King was the one that was beaten, the jurors' view and the public's view was he was the bad person. And then he got what he would deserve. But we had to fight through that.
He handles every case of importance that I know of in the Bay Area and around the country. I think you could call John the godfather of police litigation.
Yay! Help me up.
You follow me? Okay.
All right. Along with the godfather of police litigation, we have the godfather of many things, the mayor, a wonderful attorney himself, the Honorable Willie Lewis Brown, Jr.
John is a very good friend of mine, and based on my conduct, I need good friends, especially lawyers as a good friend. But you know, it's interesting because in the world of politics, you can find yourself in a situation in which you can evaluate sometimes what lawyers do or don't do. I recall, John, telling the world that you have been singularly responsible for more resignations involving police chiefs than anybody else in the history of this country. The nature of how you have proceeded to protect the rights of people and secure the rights of people and make sure that those who violated those rights would no longer have the titles that would give them that opportunity. And you've been so successful that I actually recommended that in Alameda County and Contra Costa County, those two counties really ought to list in their items that they tax us for, they should put John Burroughs. But only after they have fired their police chief.
You're right.
And that's why I thought I'd drop by. I'm also in your film, you know.
Yeah. To say the least, right.
I'm in your, yes, I'm in your film, and so I have frankly enjoyed, and I enjoyed the little bit I was able to be here for the presentation that was made, and I indicated that I wanted to say congratulations, brother, on behalf of all the lawyers whom you have counseled and given directions to, and the politicians you have supported as if you own me.
Thank you, brother. Thank you.
All right, I gotta go.
All right. Typical.
Thank you.
Okay.
So, John, good evening. How are you?
Good, good.
So we've seen, this documentary has been around a little bit, and you've had a chance to sort of view it and see how you're portrayed, and so I'm interested in that. But I want to let the audience know that John was questioning authority from a very young age. I read that as a child growing up in Vallejo, you were suspicious of Santa Claus, and that narrative.
I was.
Was it because there was no chimney on your house, or what was your deal?
I just couldn't believe that a white guy was coming down my chimney. And I ultimately did two Black Santa Claus cases you probably were not aware of. That in the 1980s, I had two young men come to me, one in Richmond and one in Southland Mall, who wanted to be Santa Claus. And these were young, heavy-set young men, and so they were not hired. So I sued in order for them to be Santa Claus. And we prevailed, and the side story there is I'm being interviewed by one of the places came out of Cherry Hill, New Jersey, if anyone remembers that. That's where these places come out of that did the Santa Claus things at various places. So I got a telephone, I was on the radio there in Philadelphia, New Jersey, and one of the guys yelled out, he was crazy. He says to me, "Are you people crazy in California? Doesn't everybody know that Santa Claus is white?" I said, "Not in my household, yes." And so, because I didn't use the two young men as Santa Clauses for my two children at the time. But no, those are the kind of things that I did question very, very early. And that wasn't the only thing either. That was just one of the things that I questioned. And in large measure, and I will say this because sort of my background is that not only was I upset about what I saw with my father and how he was being treated, I was very much upset about my uncles too. My uncles had been in the Navy, and you know, I was very proud of them. They were powerful young men, and they were powerful to me. I was a little boy, so I'm thinking they're giants and all. But when I found out later that their relationship in the Navy was that of mess boys and shoeshine boys and things of that nature, I was furious about it. And that sort of stuck and became part of my genre of civil rights as well, thinking about the black men who had gone before and how they had endured much of discrimination and the undermining of their manhood and the type of work that they had to do in the Navy. But of course, my dad, too, he was in the Colored Army as well. And so those are things that sort of the underpinnings of how I really framed my well-being.
But before you became a trailblazing attorney, you went to Berkeley to get an MBA to be an accountant. So what led you to leave that noble profession?
It's noble. It just wasn't for me. You know, it's noble. But I'll tell you that was a period of time when I was in transition philosophically. Robert Kennedy had just been, well, first Martin Luther King had been killed, Robert Kennedy had been killed, and I was in the process of deciding what kind of a future I was going to have. And so I ultimately concluded that even though I was working as an accountant, I had an accounting degree, I worked in a big, large CPA firm, that it wasn't what I felt I was making any kind of impact. And that largely, the reason why I've done a lot of what I've done is to figure out what is the impact of it. The individual matter was not enough for me. I needed to know how you can make a difference, and that's largely why I left criminal defense work as well, just because of that very reason, that the individual cases were not enough for me. And so that caused me to want to be in the law and to figure out what kind of impact I can have in terms of the work I chose to do. And that allowed me to participate. You know, I know I'm here on the police stuff, but I was in very big police employment type cases that at the time. Some were in the state, some were in private industry. And so I've done in some significant criminal work that I thought was important. I haven't talked much about it, but in the film you'll see I represented, and some of you will remember, I represented a 6-year-old kid back in the 1990s, which was extraordinarily important because a 6-year-old was being charged with attempted murder, and I was determined that that was not going to happen when I'm watching. So I was here, particularly when I knew that similar white kids and boys, children, had also had killed another kid or so, and they had not been charged. And so it was important to me that that was not going to happen to this particular kid. And so I fought these devils, I refer to them, but I fought these folks tooth and nail about it. And that was important to me, even though I was not being paid for it, even though it wasn't a big deal to anybody. But it was important to let people know that you can't treat a young black kid differently than you treat a white kid. And none of them should have been charged with murder as it was. So that was a big deal to me.
So you first came to prominence as Doug and Brian document in terms of those of us in the mainstream knowing about you through the Rodney King case. So the criminal case was lost. What would make you think you could prevail on the civil litigation side?
Actually, the Ryder case was way down the line in terms of work I had been doing. You know, and I'd had much success in other cases. For example, I did the 1979. I did the Melvin Black case, which was a 14-year-old boy that was shot and killed. I don't know if you were even out here at that point in time. But what's important in that case is that it had not been challenged by. You had not challenged the police in terms of cases in the Oakland Bay Area. And this 14-year-old boy was shot a number of times. And I was called upon to conduct a private investigation into it to determine whether the shooting was justified or not. And so I made a decision that was contrary to the U.S. Attorney and others groups that was important. But also came out of that case after that was a citizen review board came out. And that was an impactful decision that was made by the city after that case. And so that was important to me. And in terms of what's become, how do you make a case, as I refer to it, bigger than the four corners of the case? What can happen as a consequence of the work that you were involved in? And so I kind of look for things like that. And so the Ryder's case certainly happened, but I had been involved in other significant cases before then.
But in terms of coming into more of the public consciousness, I remember you and Rodney King. So I know you had the other cases before, and as it was mentioned in the documentary, you want things that are not just settlements. You want, as you said, the big cases, you want it to have meaning. So with Rodney King, you said, okay, this did not prevail on the criminal side. I'm going to look at it with civil litigation.
Well, yes. Obviously, as a civil rights lawyer, I'm not involved in criminal side of things, although that's not to say that I haven't sent cases to the prosecutor's office for prosecution. That has not often happened. But from the Rodney King case, it was really the first case that was in the media where there was an observation to hear what in fact took place. I'd had a number of cases in Oakland. I was doing a lot of cases in San Francisco and the Bay Area, but there was no video camera. And if you heard the dean talk about the challenges of the cases, that really was true before there was the cell phones.
Yeah.
And so Rodney King not only allowed the public to see it, but the transition that occurred from that case was it was the first time the public, the general public, had a chance to see the kind of brutality that officers, in fact, do engage in. Even though in the Rodney King case, that was not the prevailing appreciation from the general population. We took a lot of criticism. I personally took a lot of criticism. As Rodney King, as many of you would know who were then, took a lot of criticism because the view was that the police wouldn't have done to him what they in fact did unless he had done something wrong. Well, whatever he did didn't justify that level of beating. But involved in that case, we did come to understand the kind of communications that officers have in terms of their attitudes for the community that they serve. And that was kind of an eye-opener because that's when we first heard gorillas in the mist and things of that nature in terms of how they described individuals. And so that was a big deal. And as a consequence of that case, the Christopher Commission occurred, and there was substantial investigation into LAPD, and a lot of reforms came out of that case that happened and stood the test of time for a short period of time until the Ramparts case came along much later, which was very much like the Ryder's case. But cases do have that, and so I always look to see if that possibility exists.
And you talked about the cell phone video that came into play with the civilian who happened to tape Rodney King. Now phone cameras are ubiquitous and officers have the body-worn cameras. How has that changed? As you mentioned, in black and brown communities, we knew we were being brutalized by police. Now it's out there for everyone to see, but how has that changed the cases?
Well, I look at it from the transition from the time period, it's a 30-year time period, perhaps, from Rodney King to George Floyd.
Yes.
And in that time period, a huge amount of things have changed and have occurred that have made life such that people, the general population, is more willing to look at and accept the fact that police do engage in misconduct. Not everybody, but police do. So the cell phones have been critically important to that. There's been a lot of reform issues, and certainly I've been involved in those where police are being held more accountable for what they have done. There's been some criminal prosecution, but the truth of the matter is the general population has been much more willing to acknowledge that police engage in brutality. When I first started in this work, police jurors would literally turn their heads. They would not even look at you. You stand up in front of them and trying to talk about what this officer have done, and they'd be looking around and looking at their shoes, looking at other things. That's not the case now. You can get jurors will, in fact, look at you, particularly if there's a video, and surprisingly, not surprisingly, but the video is so powerful and it's contemporaneously, and so that people will not deny what they see. There might be explanations for it, like in the Rodney King case, there was all this effort by the defense lawyers to suggest that, it really wasn't 64 hits. It was, he was moving around, he was doing this. Well, jurors can make their own determination if they see a video. And so that's very important. And now, most departments, certainly of any size, have them. So that's really the first line of business. Now, I will say this. The video themselves has been very, very helpful in cutting down on some level of brutality. It's probably benefited the police more so than not, because a lot of times people make complaints because they have a visualness about what has happened to them that may not necessarily be truthful. And so we have found that video cameras or the cell phones can be more helpful to the police than not. The problem with it, of course, is when something does bad happen, Does the police turn the camera on when they're supposed to turn it on? So that's one of our big fights. I mean, a lot of these are areas that we're still working through in departments in terms of developing the standards that are necessary. I mean, we've talked a little bit about the Riders case. That case has gone on for 20 plus years. And even though the department itself is a whole lot different than it was in many ways, I mean, we don't have the level of brutality and arrest that and use of force, and certainly the shootings that they once had. But there are still areas that have to be worked on, because I've been very much adamant about and working through the whole consistency of discipline, that is to say, whether African, and this is something that you might not have thought that I'd be involved in, but I've been very concerned about whether black officers are being treated disproportionately, harshly, than white officers. So I made a big point of it that we want to look at this issue, and I want to see what the data looks like. Well, we finally looked at the data, and we turned out that was true, that African-American officers were being disciplined at a higher rate than white officers. So that's been another remedial action that we have taken on that has extended and caused the Riders case to go on further and further. We saw that when we had the young case and the young girl who was sexually molested by. Well, we were close to getting finished, but it turns out many supervisors were aware of this and had failed to take the appropriate action to prevent the conduct. So things surface, and that we have to then address. One of the areas that I am personally very much engaged in when it happened was that the police department was publicly strip searching African American young men in a public way. They have them on the corner and wherever they are, and pull their pants down and test and feel for their body parts, ostensibly looking for drugs. Well, this was kind of a minstrel act, as far as I can see, and it was about man on man trying to humiliate these young men. So I was going to stop this conduct, and we did. The Constitution was declared unconstitutional. And I will say this, many of these young men, because of the life they were leading, they just took it, right? They just took it. But I was determined to say, if you can't stick up for yourself, I'm going to stick up for you. I can't take it. And as a consequence, the conduct stopped. Now they can still search you, but they got to take you to a private place to do it, or they got to take you to the hospital, they got to take you somewhere else. But those are the kind of cases that you can make a difference in, and so, and you never know when it's going to come up. Right now, many of you know I'm involved in the Antioch case out there, and that case, people have done and said the most horrific things about the African American community and about women, trans, etc. And so we're taking on that case, and we're going to get a very positive result from it. Those are things you can do that have been done that are bigger than the individual case that you're working on. One individual case is important. Now, I will tell you that I still take small cases, and I take small cases because I understand the collateral damage that's associated with a case. You're a young guy, you're driving down the street, you get stopped wrongfully, you get upset about it, you yell and scream at the cop, whatever you're doing, you protest, contempt of cop. You then get arrested. When you get arrested, you got to get a lawyer, and you might ultimately cannot afford a lawyer, and you may plead guilty, and you then will have a record that will follow your career for the rest of your life. Yeah. And so, to me, those are the parts of federal racial profiling that is most damning, is the collateral damage that can occur to a young person's life that can adversely affect their lives for the rest of their lives. So I'm very mindful of that kind of activity. That and it goes to the whole issue of how do you protect people in many ways again, for themselves. They may not appreciate that you are looking out for their long-term health, legal health, but I understand that there are issues that can be done to do that, whether they know it or not.
And part of the reason people will call you a young man in that situation or a young woman is because of your visibility. And you have become a master of the news conference. And I can remember back in the day, other lawyers criticizing, saying, it was kind of grandstanding, take the case into the courtroom, why are you holding these news conferences? But it put a face to the people that you were representing. So can you talk a little bit about... This
is a very important concept, and one that I recognize, as I said back in the day, I'm not everyone's cup of tea. I get it. I get it. Yeah. Sometimes I don't even like tea, but I do drink it. But the point is, everybody doesn't like it. And part of what people didn't like, because we were trained as lawyers for the most part not to engage in publicity in public cases or in your cases. I had developed a different view, and it was part of a study when I was in a business school. I read a book by Marshall McLuhan, and I'm the correct pronunciation of his name, but it talked about the importance of media and it's important of educating and bringing information to people. So from what I looked at it, in the case that I'm involved in, most of the people I'm involved in, they have no microphone. They have no way to give free speech or give a conversation. So they can get beat up by the police. The police will give a public statement that says they beat this person up and arrested him for whatever reasons. Well, that person, if they don't say anything then, they may never get said. So my view always is, you got a statement, well, I got one for you too. And my statement is to give the other side of that statement, to show that basically saying that what the police officers did at the time was fundamentally wrong, period. And so I've always done that, and that's hated by those who represent the police. That's true. I mean, I get it, you know. But I'm not doing it for them. I'm really trying to give a voice to those who've been injured and who've been victimized by the police, because they may never get heard. That case may get resolved later, or there might be a jury trial later, and the story that they have to tell may not get told in a manner that needs to be told. So I try to tell that story as often and as soon as I can in order to make sure that at least they have been heard for that one day they may get. They may never get another day, but I'm giving them their day at the outset. And then I have to go do the case, there's no question. Just because you're a press conference, I mean, you don't do the case, you got to do the case. And so whatever those facts are, you have to deal with those facts. But for that opportunity at the beginning is to let the client know that they've had at least a voice and that somebody had something to say about what happened to them very early in the matter. And sometimes the death cases where obviously people in death cases, the family members are in a lot of pain and they don't really know. So it kind of, it's up to me or my team or people like me to tell their story when it can be told. This is very important in mental health cases that I have a lot of cases, and I'm going to the subject because this is very important to me. And this is where African American family members, and everyone has somebody in their household and their family members has some mental health problems. You just can't deny it. We all have it. And so at one point in time, you may have to call the police or call somebody for help. And what I have found down through the years, that people call for help. Look, they really call the paramedics, can you help get my loved one to the hospital of some kind? Well, what happens, the police come, they aggravate the situation, and they kill the person. And these are just frustrating cases for me, because all I know that if you de-escalated that situation and you talked to that person in a more humane way and not created a confrontation, you would not have to use deadly force. So these are big issues, and so I tell that story. That cop shouldn't have done that. The cops should not have kindred like gun blazing and have the dogs or the motorbike and all the things that will arouse a mentally impaired person. What you didn't know, you can't talk to a mentally impaired person like he's a reasonable person. Mm-hmm. You got to find another way to talk to him. And so those are issues that I've been involved in very, very strong. And they don't necessarily carry over in terms of the public way. They may be important in that local community at that time, but they don't get national attention for the most part unless there's something unusual about it. But if it's a mentally impaired person, generally, it will get very little attention. And the media will normally write the story for the police. My job is then to contradict that story, at least give an alternative to it as soon as possible.
Mm-hmm. Before you started really specializing in police misconduct, cases of excessive force, there weren't that many civil rights attorneys taking on that tact.
Right.
Can you talk more about what led you to that path to say, well, I'm going to be the one, because you're going up against a huge machine.
You know, I never thought about it in that I was going up against these machines. I thought about, look, this is what I'm going to do. And I was a criminal defense lawyer, and I wasn't, I practiced law with a chip on my shoulder. That's kind of the funny part about it, but I was always angry and pissed off at these people. And I hated them all. And so I was already attuned to that kind of mindset. And then when I'm doing criminal defense work, I get I can see what the police would do to these people, in these criminal cases. They beat them up and then charge them with crimes. And so I got a glimpse of that. Plus, I had been in Chicago where I had seen all this police stuff. So in my own mind's eye, I could see this. And I saw there was one or two other lawyers who had done one or two other type cases. I decided in 1985 that I was going to leave my firm with Dave Alexander and Elhue Harris, who were close personal friends of mine, and go and do this civil rights thing. And I was determined to do it, and I did criminal defense work along the way in order to help finance the business. But I always thought, I never thought the opposition was some giant entity, and that that I was up against. I didn't view myself as David versus Goliath. I viewed them as cops, and me, and that's how I saw it, and I still do, So.
What case are you most proud of? I would think maybe the Riders, because it led to dozens and dozens of reforms. But what would you say?
I get asked this question all the time. And I guess it depends on the audience I'm talking to at the time. Because yesterday, a bunch of kids asked me this question up in Sacramento, and I told them about Tupac. Yeah. Tupac was important to them.
Sure.
But it was not important to me at the time that I did the case. So no. The 6-year-old case was very important to me. I mentioned that earlier because it was a community that came up to me and asked me to do it. I represented another case that many of you may remember, the Cocaine Mom case I did back in the 80s, where this lady was under the influence of cocaine, doing crack cocaine. When crack cocaine was really big, that was in the 80s, and so she was doing crack, and she had 2 babies or whatever, whatever you call them. So I represented her. It was pro bono. I had a doctor call me up and ask me would I represent her. And told me I went and met her and saw her circumstances. I said, yeah, I'll represent this lady, because I thought it wasn't a situation she should be charged with murder. She was under the influence. Crack cocaine was a huge thing at the time. People were addicted to it. She obviously was addicted, and so maybe she didn't act like a mom who was having babies. It should have acted away, but that wasn't murder to me. And so I felt very strongly about that case, and obviously, the case with the most impact, obviously, is the Riders case in terms of impact. But there have been a lot of cases that I've been involved in, and at the time, they were the most important case. I must tell you that.
Each case is the most
important case, and and then the next question is, what's the next? Well, the next case might be the most important case. I don't actually live in any way in the past about cases. Case is over. I've done what I can do. I hope I've done the best I can, but I move on to the next case. That's how I live my life,
So you've mentored so many, as we saw in the documentary, so many up-and-coming attorneys. And what legacy do you want to leave?
Well, it's very, very important to me that there be a legacy of people who follow me. I believe very strongly in the ancestors' notion of life, and that there are people who come before me that paved the way, people you have never heard of, but if you read the history books, in every town, there were people there who were fighting the battle was there. And they may not ever make the history books that you will know. And so my feeling always has been that you should train as many people as you can so that they can continue to struggle, because the struggle will not end. And as I stand on the shoulders of, and I really do stand on the shoulders of people like Clinton White and Henry Ramsey and Willie Brown, Delton Henderson, because when I was a young lawyer, I looked at those guys. I really looked at these guys and see what they were doing. And in many ways, I want to be like them, but not like them in a real sense, because the kind of practice they had was not the kind of practice I thought I wanted. But what I wanted was, and what I saw in them, was their stand-upness, the ability to stand up and fight the battle, whatever form they were in. And so that was important to me as a lesson, So to the extent I can communicate that information on to others who have a desire to do it, but you can't make people do it, then I want to show them the way to do it. And so we have a lot of mentoring events that I have. I counsel a lot of lawyers. I speak at a lot of conventions. I travel around the world giving talks on different subject matters. That's all about sparking. And I do tell the story, and anybody that asks me about how do I end all this, I'm running a relay. I ran track once upon a time, in my youth, okay? And part of that, I'd run a leg on the relay. And then when you finish your leg, you hand it off to the next person. You hope that person was in full stride so that when you hand it off to them, there's no break in the action and you stepped off the curb. That's how I see it. And that's how I plan to end it, frankly,
That's probably a nice place to end it on, but I also wanted to ask you about the rightward shift of this country and what impact do you think that'll have on police brutality cases? Will juries be less inclined to give decent settlements or to even see again through clear eyes what's going on?
Well, I will say it's troubling,
Yes.
very concerning, particularly with the Justice Department. And I say that because the Justice Department, say under Obama and Biden, and to some extent Bush too, you could look to the Justice Department to take on pattern and practice of police departments. And so you could bring in consent decrees and things of that nature, and they have been good at doing that. And Biden had a number of them going on at the time. Trump came in the first time and stopped a couple of things we were involved in. One was in San Francisco and one was in Salinas that I was involved in. They stopped them completely. So the new Justice Department, the DOJ that's come in the Civil Rights Division in the last week or two, they've closed down the Justice Department. Now, at least they've closed down the Civil Rights section. Now, whether that reopens or not remains to be seen. However, the person they appointed to head up this is a right-wing conservative lawyer. So it's really going to turn on its head the type of civil rights work that we like and do. That will be turned upside down, and now we'll be promoting reverse discrimination type cases, anti-trans cases, anti-cases that I can see on the horizon. Now, to me, that's not necessarily going to affect my individual ability, me or whoever the lawyers follow me, to do the individual work. It just means you will not have the government to be in place to help with some of the pattern and practice cases. Now, that's one look. The other look is on the federal courts. And I always, when I give these talks, I tell people, you got to remember the courts is where a lot of things are going to get decided, even though most people don't go to court, because the police, the laws that govern police are in fact, some of it is decided by the U.S. Supreme Court. But much of the daily interpretation of those cases occur at the federal level. And what we now, and at the federal level, the president appoints the federal judges. Well, Trump, in the last time, appointed over 200 federal judges. Biden appointed over 200. So there's kind of a bit of a balance. But Trump's going to be at it again, so he'll get appointed another 200. And so the interpretation of the laws will be much more consistent with Trump's MAGA philosophy, very conservative philosophy. And it'll probably be more difficult in terms of cases as they go before the various circuit court judges, as I foresee it in the years to come. So it will be more challenging for everyone. And rest assured that the Trump's philosophy is that police are not and should not in any way be controlled by outside forces like lawyers like myself, that the police should have, in fact, immunity to do the conduct they engage in, which is a very challenging concept to accept. But I think we have to be prepared that it's going to be more conservative. But there's always been warriors. And every generation will have warriors who will fight the battle, no matter what the odds are. So I do not look on dismay. I'm just saying the battle is going to be enjoined at another level, and lawyers who are present, and community people, because it can't be just lawyers. Lawyers have our role, but the community also has its role. That you do have to maintain a willingness to fight and engage in the struggle, no matter what. Period, regardless. That's awesome.
Well, thank you for being a warrior, a trailblazer, and continuing the good fight. And thank you for being here tonight, and continued success.
All right. Thank you. Good to be here. All right. I got to get up.
I want to thank you, Carolyn, for moderating tonight. And for Brian and Doug, thank you for allowing us to screen your important and groundbreaking documentary. And John, thank you for your ongoing fight for social justice.
Thank you, brother.
And thank you all for attending this evening. Thank you very, very much.